All right, so picture this. You loan someone a hefty sum of money, and they start missing payments for years.
Oh,
And then when they finally cough up the full amount,
okay.
you decide to hit them with a massive penalty.
That doesn't sound quite right.
Yeah, it feels a bit off, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what went down in this wild Philippine Supreme Court case we're diving into today.
Well, this sounds juicy already.
It is. It's called GR No 73345.
Got it.
And you've given us some pretty interesting legal documents about it.
Yep. Looking forward to digging into these.
So we're going to try to untangle all the twists and turns of this crazy legal battle.
It really makes you wonder about power dynamics and accountability, even when big institutions mess up.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's set the scene.
All right, let's do it.
We've got Social Security System, a major government agency in the Philippines.
Right, the SSS.
Exactly. They loan over P12 million, a huge sum at the time.
Wow, it's a lot of money.
It is to a housing corporation called Moonwalk.
Moonwalker, okay.
Interesting. Seems like a typical loan deal on the surface, right?
Yeah, at first glance.
But remember, the SSS is dealing with funds meant to support a huge portion of the population.
Right, so their actions have a ripple effect beyond just this one loan.
Exactly. Okay, so Moonwalk, they hit some roadblocks and start missing those loan payments.
Trouble in paradise.
You'd think the SSS would be all over them, right?
Yeah, you'd assume so. I mean, they're responsible for all that money.
Right. They initially make a move to foreclose on the mortgages, which is the standard playbook in these situations.
Makes sense. Got to protect their investment.
But then get this, they back off.
Wait, they just let it slide?
It's like a legal head-scratcher. Years go by with no apparent action from the SSS.
So they just sat on it for years.
Wow. Then, out of the blue, they send Moonwalk a statement of account.
And I'm guessing this is where things get interesting.
You bet Moonwalk, despite being years behind, pays it all off in one go.
They had the money all along.
Apparently, the SSS even releases the mortgages, seemingly ending the saga.
So case closed, everyone goes home happy?
You wish. That's where the real twist comes in.
I knew there was more to this.
A few months later, the SSS drops a bombshell. They claim there was a mistake.
A mistake? What kind of mistake?
And demand millions in penalties from Moonwalk.
Oh, wow. Talk about adding insult to injury.
Right. So Moonwalk, after settling everything, is suddenly facing this massive extra bill.
I bet they weren't too thrilled about that.
Not at all. They argued they had paid everything according to the SSS's own statement.
So now it's a he said, she said situation.
Exactly. The whole thing landed in the Supreme Court.
Oh, wow. It went all the way up.
Yep. And that's where things get really interesting.
I'm all ears. So how did the Supreme Court even begin to unravel this mess?
Well, the case boils down to this legal concept called penal clauses in contracts.
Penal clauses.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm familiar with those, but for our listeners who might not be, can you break that down a bit?
Of course. Think of them like hefty late fees designed to encourage timely payments.
Right, like a little extra incentive to stay on track.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Moonwalk did pay late. So shouldn't the penalty apply?
Yeah, that's what seems logical. What's the catch?
It's not as simple as just being late. These penalties have specific rules about when they can be enforced.
So there's more to it than meets the eye.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what else comes into play?
There has to be a formal demand from the lender.
A demand. So they can't just automatically tack on the penalty.
Nope. It has to be either through court action or a very clear written notification.
So it's like officially putting the borrower on notice that they're in default and those penalties are now active.
Exactly. And this is where the SSS's case starts to crumble.
Oh, really?
How so? They never sent that formal demand for the penalties before Moonwalk paid the main debt.
So even though Moonwalk was behind on payments, the SSS never took that extra step to actually trigger the penalties.
You got it. It's like setting a trap but forgetting to bait it.
Wow, so it's a technicality, but a pretty significant one, it seems.
Exactly. The court found no evidence of that formal demand.
And to make matters even more complicated, there was that whole attempt to foreclose back in 1977, which they eventually dropped.
Right, when Moonwalk promised to pay up.
Yeah, that definitely muddies the waters. It makes it seem like they didn't consider Moonwalk in serious default at that point.
Exactly. It's like sending mixed signals, and the Supreme Court definitely picked up on that.
So even though Moonwalk was behind for years, the SSS's actions didn't quite align with the legal requirements for triggering those penalties.
That's the crux of it.
Seemed like a pretty big oversight on the SSS's part.
You could say that. So even though Moonwalk was clearly behind for years, the SSS never followed the proper procedures to trigger those penalties.
Wow, so what happened next? What did the Supreme Court ultimately decide?
Well, that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive.
Can't wait to hear it.
Stay tuned. So the big question is, did the court side with the powerful government agency or the company that was admittedly behind on payment?
Well, get this. The Supreme Court actually sided with Moonwalk.
Wow, really? So even though they were late, they were in the clear because of this technicality.
You got it. It all boils down to a specific article in the Philippine Civil Code, Article 1226, which lays out the rules for these penal clauses.
Okay, so let's break that down for our listener. What does this Article 1226 actually say?
In simple terms, it says that if a contract has a penalty clause, that penalty takes the place of things like separate claims for damages or interest, unless there's a specific agreement that says otherwise. But here's the kicker. The penalty can only be enforced when it's demandable, according to the rest of the legal code.
Okay, demandable. That sounds like lawyer speak. What makes a penalty demandable in this situation?
Good question. Think of it like this. Imagine you borrow a library book and it's due back on Monday. You're late, but the library doesn't automatically hit you with a massive late fee, right? They usually send a reminder first, maybe even a couple of reminders before the penalty really kicks in.
Right, that makes sense. So there needs to be a clear warning before the hammer drops.
Exactly. And that's what the Supreme Court zeroed in on in this case. They said that for a penalty to be demandable, the debtor needs to be officially considered in delay or in default. And that doesn't just happen automatically because someone missed a payment.
So it's not enough to just be behind on payments. There has to be a formal demand from the lender.
You got it. The law requires a clear and official notification that the borrower is in default, and those penalties are now active. That notification can be a legal action like filing a case in court or a very explicit written notice.
So the SSS really messed up by not sending that formal demand before Moonwalk settled the main debt.
Exactly. They sent the statement, Moonwalk paid, and only then did the SSS come knocking for more money. The court saw that as a major procedural misstep.
And to make things even more complicated, there was that whole attempt to foreclose on the mortgages back in 1977, which they ultimately dropped when Moonwalk promised to pay.
Right. That really weakens the SSS's argument because it shows that at one point they were willing to negotiate and didn't consider Moonwalk officially in default.
So even though Moonwalk was clearly behind for years, the SSS's actions didn't line up with the legal requirements for triggering those penalties.
That's the heart of the matter. The court basically said Moonwalk might have been delinquent in a general sense, but they weren't technically in delay from a legal standpoint because that formal demand was never made.
It seems like a subtle difference, but I guess in the world of law, those nuances can make a huge difference.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
This case really drives home the point that even big, powerful organizations like the SSS have to play by the rules. Everyone is bound by the same legal procedures.
It's a good reminder for all of us that understanding those rules and being careful about following them can be incredibly important, especially when we're talking about legal agreements.
Couldn't agree more. But this case also brings up some bigger questions about the balance of power in these situations.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that there's a debate about whether organizations like the SSS should have more flexibility to recover funds, even if they didn't follow every single procedure perfectly.
Exactly. Think about it. The SSS manages funds that are meant to support a huge portion of the population. There's an argument to be made that they should have some leeway to get that money back, even if there were some procedural hiccups along the way.
That makes sense. I mean, those funds are ultimately meant to help people in need, so it seems like a waste if they're lost due to technicalities.
Right. But on the flip side, there's the issue of fairness and accountability.
Yeah.
What kind of message does it send if powerful institutions can just bend the rules whenever it's convenient?
That's a good point. Where do we draw the line between protecting those funds and ensuring that everyone is treated fairly under the law?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And it's one that legal experts and policymakers are constantly grappling with. This case gives us a really interesting way to look at those complex issues.
It's amazing how a seemingly straightforward loan dispute can lead to such deep, thought-provoking questions.
That's the beauty of the law. It's a reflection of our values as a society, and it's constantly evolving as we face new challenges and dilemmas.
So what are some of the potential long-term implications of this ruling? Could it change how similar cases are handled in the future?
Yeah, it's like this one case has opened up a whole can of worms, legally speaking. What are we looking at here? What kind of impact could this have on future cases?
Well, this isn't just about the SSS anymore, you know?
Right.
This ruling sets a precedent that other courts might follow when deciding similar cases.
Okay.
It puts a big emphasis on sticking to legal procedures, even when you're dealing with these powerful government agencies.
So it's about leveling the playing field in a way, making sure everyone's held to the same standards regardless of their size or influence.
Exactly. It reinforces the idea that no one is above the law, and that even those seemingly small procedural missteps can have huge consequences.
This makes me think about all kinds of scenarios. What if a bank tries to charge late fees without sending proper notifications? Or if a government agency tries to impose penalties without giving clear notice?
Those are great examples. This ruling could give individuals and companies more leverage to push back against those kinds of actions.
Oh, interesting.
And demand that due process is followed. It's all about protecting individual rights.
It's almost like this case has shifted the balance of power a bit,
Right.
giving the little guy more of a fighting chance against these big institutions.
It certainly seems that way, and it really underscores the crucial role of the courts in upholding fairness and ensuring that everyone's playing by the same rules.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We started with what seemed like a simple loan dispute,
Right.
but it's uncovered all these legal complexities
Absolutely.
and raised important questions about government agencies, the importance of clear communication in contracts, and the balance of power in legal battles.
It just goes to show that even a single case can reveal so much about how our legal system works and how it affects us all.
So for our listener out there, what's the big takeaway here? What should we all keep in mind after diving into this case?
I think the key takeaway is that we all need to be aware of our rights and responsibilities, even in seemingly routine legal matters. As we've seen, even small oversights can have major consequences.
Absolutely, and we can't just assume that big institutions will always get it right.
Right.
We need to stay informed and be prepared to advocate for ourselves if necessary.
Knowledge is power, as they say.
Definitely.
And understanding the ins and outs of legal agreements can help us navigate these situations more effectively.
So if you're ever in a similar situation, maybe a contract dispute, a disagreement over fees, or any situation where you feel like the other party isn't following the rules, remember the lessons from this case.
Do your research, understand your rights, and don't hesitate to seek legal advice if you need it.
Well said. This has been a truly fascinating deep dive. Thanks for guiding us through it all. Your insights have been invaluable.
My pleasure. I always enjoy exploring these legal puzzles with you.
And to our listener out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world around you. You never know what fascinating insights you might uncover. Until next time, fellow deep divers.